Hey, it's Kevin again, and in this video we want to talk about troubleshooting in your CCIE Collaboration lab. And I call troubleshooting the deal breaker because it really can be. Think about it. You've practiced these technologies over and over again. You've read through documents, you've read through white papers, you've read through all kinds of Cisco Press books, you've got your hands on the gear, and while knowing how to set everything up is great, we can still fail the lab if we're not able to effectively troubleshoot. And we're going to be troubleshooting on a couple of fronts here. We're going to be troubleshooting the mistakes that we personally make. It's hard for me to do configuration for nearly 8 hours without making any mistakes. I'll probably make multiple mistakes, and I need to be able to spot and quickly correct those. The other type of troubleshooting we have to do is troubleshooting issues that are pre-existing on the lab. You see, before we even step foot in the lab, Cisco has already gone in and they have injected some troubleshooting issues. And we need to avoid those traps, be able to quickly detect what they did, and quickly resolve it. And in this video, I want to give us some things to think about at a high level when it comes to troubleshooting on the CCIE Collaboration Lab. The first area we're going to talk about is endpoint registration. Maybe your IP phones are not registering. How do we troubleshoot that? And not just IP phones, maybe we've got an MGCP gateway that's not registering. Maybe we're not able to get to our communications manager server, it's not available. Maybe we've got a database replication issue where the publisher and the subscriber do not share a common database. That can lead to all sorts of issues. What about Cisco Unity Express? What do we need to do there? Cisco Unity Connection. It can come with its own set of potential troubleshooting issues, as well as a Unified Contact Center Express and the IM and Present server. Let's get started, though, by talking about some common endpoint registration troubleshooting things to think about on the lab. If the phone doesn't have power, we might want to check the PoE, the Power over Ethernet configuration on our switch port. And once our phone has power, if we're running CDP, we need to use CDP version 2 for that phone to dynamically learn its VLAN membership. And once it learns its VLAN membership, it can make an intelligent DHCP request. Now let's think about this for a moment. I made a point of saying it was CDP version 2. It's possible that our switch is running CDP, but it's not version 2. That's not going to tell us our VLAN. But once we do know our VLAN membership, as we're making that DHCP request, remember how DHCP works? It uses the DORA process, D-O-R-A. It sends a discover message. We get an offer message from DHCP servers on the network. Then we send an R, a request, and we get an acknowledgement. D-O-R-A, discover offer request acknowledgement. But think about that initial discover message. It's a broadcast. What happens to a broadcast when it tries to cross a router boundary? Well, by default, it gets dropped, doesn't it? So we need to make sure our voice VLANs interface or sub interface or SVI, we need to make sure that that's got an appropriate IP helper-address command on it that can forward our DHCP broadcast to the appropriate destination. And as part of that DHCP response, in addition to getting IP address information and subnet mask information and default gateway information, we also get DHCP option 150. That tells us the IP address of a TFTP server. And if we're still not registering, we might want to go and check out that TFTP server. Maybe it's a Communications Manager Express router. Maybe it's a Communications Manager server. It's from that TFTP server that the phone downloads its configuration file. We might want to make sure that that's working correctly. And as we talk about some of these different troubleshooting areas, I want to demonstrate a few common things I do as I'm going through a practice lab. So let's go out to a switch I have in my topology. Here I'm sitting on a switch at my HQ side. It's a Cisco Catalyst 3750 series switch, and here's something that I always do as I'm going through a mock lab. I'm going to go in to global configuration mode, and I'm not even going to take the time to see if CDP is configured, if it's configured correctly. I don't want to spend valuable time determining that things are working or not, because I can set things up correctly very, very quickly. First of all, I'm going to say CDP run, so that makes CDP active. Now I want to make sure that I'm running version 2. I'll say CDP advertise -v2, and I want to make sure that the CDP timer is not set to some artificially high value. I'll say CDP timer 5. And by giving those 3 commands, which I can do in just a few seconds, I've eliminated CDP traps that might have been set for me. Now let's talk about another area of troubleshooting. What if our CUCM, our Cisco Unified Communications Manager, is not reachable? It's not available at the moment. What might be going on? Well, one thing we can do is use RTMT, the real-time monitoring tool, to check the CPU and memory utilization to see if we have an issue there. And by the way, I'm going to be taking you out live, and we'll be taking a look at RTMT in a few moments. We're going to use RTMT to diagnose a possible replication issue. And when we go out there, I'll show you how we can check the CPU and memory utilization. If that appears to be fine, we might want to check our services. Do we have our services running? Remember, it's the Tomcat service that gives us that web interface into our Communications Manager server. It's possible that the Call Manager service, the main service behind our voice processing, maybe it's turned off. And even though you probably wouldn't want to do this in the real world, in the lab, I typically go in and enable all of the services on all of my Communication Manager servers, except the DHCP service. I want to do that very strategically, only where I need it. I don't want to inadvertently hand out IP addresses that I don't intend to. But other than that, on a lab, I want to make sure that all of my services are running. But let's say that we can get to our Communications Manager, but things just are not behaving as we would think they would behave. Let's say, for example, that I go into my Communications Manager interface and I add a secondary line. I add a directory number to an IP phone, and I say reset the phone. But as I look at the phone, nothing seems to be happening. It just sits there. And I think, well, that's odd. I know I added the line. I know I added this directory number. I know I said to reset the phone, but nothing's happening. What might be going on here is the phone is registered to a subscriber server, and when you did your configuration, that was written to the publisher server, and maybe the database of the publisher and the subscriber are not in sync. There's a replication issue. And this can happen even accidentally. In the lab environment, since they're bringing these VMware-based servers up of a morning before you go in and take the lab, it's very possible that there is an unintentional database replication issue that you have to fix. And that's a classic symptom. You make a change on a phone, and it's not reflected on the phone. You tell the phone to reset, and it does nothing. Let's go out to the real-time monitoring tool, RTMT, and in addition to going back and taking a look at the memory and processor utilization, let's see a really easy way to determine whether or not we have a database replication issue. Then we'll come back and see how to fix a replication issue if we do indeed have one. Here we're taking a look at the RTMT, the real-time monitoring tool screen, and from the system summary we can get some really valuable information. We can see that the CPU usage for our publisher, that's the blue line, and the subscriber, that's the red line, they seem to be fine. We don't seem to have much disk usage, memory usage is low, all that looks great. But let's say that we suspect that we have a database replication issue, and we want to check to see if we do. Here's a really easy way to do that. We just fire up RTMT, and we go to the Call Manager area, and we can go into Database Summary. Now, the appropriate replication status, if everything is up and healthy and happy, is a replication status of a 2. And we can look really quickly at our publisher, and we can see that its replication status is indeed a 2. Here's the subscriber. It's a 2. Fantastic. There is one thing that caused me a bit of panic the first time I saw it, because I didn't really understand what was happening. I know that a 2 is a good number. Anything else, like a 4, that's a bad number. And I saw that my cluster replication status was a 4, and I thought, oh no, what's going on? But check out what's happening here. This really doesn't mean much to us at all. What this interface is doing is it's taking the individual values, like total number of connection clients, 55 and 40. It's just adding those up to give us a total for the cluster. 55 plus 40, that's 95. Yeah, that's what it's doing here. It's adding the replication status of a 2 on the publisher to the replication status of a 2 on the subscriber, and it says, well, your cluster replication status is a 4. Yeah, that doesn't really mean something bad here. Let's ignore that. We're looking at the individual server's replication status. These are just a couple of things we can do here on RTMT. But let's go back and talk about how we would resolve a database replication issue if we did indeed have one. Even though in our example we did not have a database replication issue, if we did, we can usually resolve it. I would say about 9 times out of 10 we can resolve it by doing a secure shell connection into our publisher server and issuing this command. We can say utils db replication repair all. In my experience, that will almost always fix a basic database replication issue. Now let's think about Cisco Unity Express. We probably have a router, and in that router we have a Unity Express module. How do we avoid any traps that have been laid for us there? Well, here's my recommendation. On the lab, I'm not going to trust any existing configuration on my Unity Express module. In just about every instance when I'm doing a practice lab, I will go in and wipe out the existing Cisco Unity Express configuration. I will restore it to factory defaults. That way, if there had been some trap laid for me in some subtle command in the Unity Express configuration, I don't have to worry about it because I've reset things to factory defaults and I can quickly set things up by just giving a few commands at the command line. Let's take a look now at how we can reset things on the Cisco Unity Express module to a factory default setting. Here on router BR2, I want to get to my Unity Express module that's installed in this router. I'm going to say service-module, and then I'm going to give the identifier of the service module. It's SM1/0, and then I'm going to say session. When I say session, I'm saying I want to establish a telnet session with that module. And we're connected. And if I were starting my Unity Express configuration on the lab, and I came to a prompt like this, I could see that some configuration has already been done. I'm not at the factory default setting. It's not prompting me with that initialization wizard. Then I'm going to do this. I'm going to say offline, and it says, are you sure you want to go offline? I'll say yes. Yes, I'm sure. And once we're offline, I'm going to say restore factory default. I'm not actually going to press enter and go through that process here, but this is the command you would use to restore your Unity Express module to a factory default setting. It would reboot, and it would take about 3 minutes or so to come back, and you would go through that initialization wizard, and you would have a nice, pristine configuration that you could then go modify to meet your lab tasks. In addition to Cisco Unity Express, we probably have 1 or maybe 2 Cisco Unity connection servers in our topology. What are some things to check here when it comes to troubleshooting? Well, the integration with a Communications Manager boils down to 3 primary components, those being the phone system, the port group, and the ports that belong to that port group. So here's what I suggest. I suggest that we take a look at each of these, make sure that we have ports if the integration has already been done for us. Make sure those ports are assigned to a correct port group because there may be more than one port group configured. And let's make sure the port group is assigned to an appropriate phone system. Again, there may be more than one phone system configured. Let's clearly understand which ports point to which port group, and let's make sure we understand what phone system that port group is pointing to. And we can also have an issue with permissions. If the integration has already been done for us and we think, wow, lucky us, we've already got ports configured and they're already assigned to a port group and that port group is already assigned to a phone system. Excellent. Well, not so fast. Remember that as part of your configuration, you added the partitions and the calling search spaces in your environment. Those did not exist when this integration initially was done before you stepped foot in the lab. That means that your ports probably do not have an appropriate calling search space. Your MWI ports do not have permissions to call into a phone to illuminate or to turn out a message waiting indicator. So let's go out to a Cisco Unity connection screen and take a look at some things that we can check really quickly as we're encountering a Unity connection on the lab. Remember that Unity connection can be integrated with Communications Manager via a skinny integration or via a SIP integration. In this case, on this particular Unity connection server, I'm using a skinny integration. And with a skinny integration, my ports actually register with Communications Manager. That's not the case with a SIP integration. But here, I've got a skinny integration, and I'm going to go check and make sure that I have ports. Do I have ports? Yes, I do. Excellent. Let's go into one of these ports. These ports are associated with the port group named Phone System 1. Let's make sure that port group exists and is configured correctly. Yeah, here's Phone System 1, and it's associated with the phone system called Phone System. Excellent. We can go in and check that. Make sure nothing suspicious jumps out at us. Now, let's pretend that when we first connected to the Unity connection server in the real lab, that we already had this in place. We've already got the ports. Well, if we've already got the ports, then we probably need to check out the calling search spaces of those ports and the calling search spaces of the message waiting indicator numbers. If we go back into our port group for a moment, you'll see that we've got a couple of MWI extensions. If these were already in existence before we encountered this on the lab, we can almost guarantee ourselves that these extensions do not have permission to call the phones because we've probably placed the directory number of a phone into a partition. And since these extensions were pre-existing, they probably do not have an appropriate calling search space. So what we can do is go over to our Communications Manager, and under Advanced Features Voicemail, we can take a look at our voicemail ports. Let's check them out. And we see that I've got a couple of voicemail ports. Excellent. And those ports are registered. Now, this is because I've already set these things up correctly, but if you had a pre-existing Unity connection integration, you would probably not see a calling search space right here. I've got one assigned, but you would probably not see that in an existing integration. So you would want to come into this port and set an appropriate calling search space. Also, under Advanced Features Voicemail, let's go into our message waiting indicators. We'll do a find. These also probably do not have an appropriate calling search space. Now, in this case, they do. I've already set it up. But look at this. If I did not have an appropriate calling search space for my MWI on and my MWI off directory numbers, then we would not have permission to call our phones to turn that light on or off. Some things to think about when we run into a Unity connection integration. Next, let's think about a Unified Contact Center Express configuration. I want to take you out live in a few moments and show you some common things we can check out. But one thing we can do, which is really nice, is we can have the server automatically check the JTAPI integration between our UCCX server and our Communications Manager server. And if it says you've got problems, then we can say, okay, go fix it. We can force a resync. Let me show you how we can do that. Here we are on our Unified Contact Center Express server, and we can go under Subsystems, Cisco Unified CM Telephony, and then go into Data Synchronization, and we can say we want to do a data synchronization check, let's say of our call control groups. Let's do a data check. And we'll say, okay, let's do it. And in my case, it came back and said that everything was successful. This is configured correctly. I've got lots of check marks under my status. But let's say that was not the case. Let's say that I did that call control group check and it came back and told me that I was missing CTI ports. Let me show you something to watch out for in the lab. If it says we don't have our CTI ports configured, the temptation might be to say, okay, I'll fix that, do a data resync, and it will recreate those CTI ports and it will make the integration work. Well, that sounds like a good deal, but let's pretend that the lab task told us that we had to use specific directory numbers for those CTI ports. Well, before we just say do a data resync, let's do this. Let's go over and under Device, Phone, let's do a find. And in my case, things are set up correctly. Here are my two CTI ports. But let's pretend that we encountered this on the lab and we did not have these two devices, these two CTI ports created on our Communications Manager. If we just said data resync, it would create these ports. However, would it use the directory numbers of 2701 and 2702? It depends. It depends on whether or not those directory numbers already exist. Here's what I suggest you do to avoid a potential fatal trap on the lab. Let's go under Call Routing and go under Directory Number and do a find. Now, if those CTI ports did not exist, then we don't want their directory numbers to exist here. If that's the situation we find ourselves in, no CTI ports, but their directory numbers do exist, then we would want to select these two directory numbers and we would delete those. Then we could safely go back to our UCCX server and say that we wanted to do a data resync. Because if those directory numbers existed and we were told to use directory numbers of 2701 and 2702, if those DNs already existed, this data resync would use 2703 and 2704. We would lose points there. Be careful of that. In fact, while we're mentioning these directory numbers on a slightly different note, this is also something that it's good to check early on in your lab. I would want to go in under Call Routing and say, show me my directory numbers, and see if we have any existing numbers that we might need to configure in the lab. Let's go through and delete any numbers that maybe are going to be assigned to phones that we've not set up yet. That could be another trap that's laid for us. Next, let's consider our IM and present server. When it comes to troubleshooting, we're really fortunate with the IM and present server because there is an integrated troubleshooter built in. That's pretty fantastic. It can go through and check several things to let us know if this is integrated correctly, if this is set up correctly, and it even gives us a link to go fix whatever's not working correctly. So that's one thing we might want to do if we seem to have some sort of an issue with our integration between the IM and present server and the Communications Manager server. Something else that might not be working right is presence information itself. Let's say that we've got that SIP trunk created between our Communications Manager server and our IM and present server, but presence information doesn't seem to be going across that trunk. What could be going on here? Well, it could be that the SIP trunk is not set up correctly. We need to go in and edit the SIP trunk security profile to allow presence information to flow across that trunk. In fact, there are some things we need to do to this SIP trunk security profile to have a Cisco Unity connection integration with Communications Manager. So I want to take you out live and I want to show you a quick tip as to how we can set up the SIP trunk security profile that will both support sending presence information in an IM and presence integration and support our Unity connection integration. And then I'll take you over and show you that integrated troubleshooter built into the IM and presence server. Here on Communications Manager, let's go under System, Security, and choose SIP Trunk Security Profile. And I'm using just the non-secure SIP trunk profile, and that's assigned to any SIP trunks that I create. And notice that I've got 4 boxes checked. These boxes are not checked by default, but if you check these 4 boxes, then you are correctly provisioning your trunk to support a Unity connection integration and an IM and presence server integration where presence information can flow across this trunk. Now here's a memory aid for you. Because we've got several boxes, how do you know which ones to check? Check the ones that begin with the word accept. Notice that there are 4 boxes that begin with the word accept. Check those. And that's going to help us correctly provision our trunk. Now, let's go over to the IM and presence server and take a look at that integrated troubleshooter I was telling you about. On the IM and presence server, we can go under Diagnostics, and we can go into System Troubleshooter. And it's going to take a few moments, and it's going to scan several configuration settings on the system, and it's going to come back and tell us if anything needs attention. Under this first section, everything looks good. We've got green checkboxes. That looks good. The presence engine looks good. The SIP proxy looks good. It looks like my Microsoft Remote Call Control is currently inactive, and that's okay. I'm aware of that. And I've not configured calendaring, and I've not configured any other clusters, so those are okay. The topology, that looks good. Cisco Jabber, that looks good. I'm not integrated with a third-party LDAP server. So all this is looking really healthy, but if something did not look healthy, then over in the solution column, there would be a description about how to resolve the situation, and in many cases, there's even a link. Maybe something's not set up correctly, maybe a service is not started. We could click on that link, and it takes us to the screen that we need to be on to fix the issue. I really wish that all of our unified communication servers had this type of troubleshooter built in, but let's definitely take advantage of it for the IM and presence server on the lab. And while we're out here, let me share with you one other thing that's a really common issue that people run into. Maybe our users don't appear to have licensing to use the IM and presence server. Licensing works very differently in version 9 as compared to prior versions. In prior versions, we would go under, on Communications Manager, we would go under System, and we would go under Licensing, and we would go into Capabilities Assignment, and there is where we would assign a user licensing to use presence features. That's not where it's done in version 9. I want you to know where to look. Let's go under User Management for our end users. Let's go into one of our end users. Let's go into the HQ Phone 2 user and scroll down just a bit. Notice that this box is checked, Enable User for Cisco IM and Presence. That's how we give this user the appropriate licensing. And we need to have a UC service profile set up. And I've got one set up that's named Presence. But these two settings in the end user configuration screen, that's what in version 9 of Communications Manager gives an end user presence licensing. Now let's wrap up this video by summarizing a few of the key points we talked about. In this video, we identified some common troubleshooting domains, areas in which we might run into issues on the lab. Endpoint registration, endpoints could be IP phones, it could be an MGCP gateway, and we talked about some common endpoint registration things that might happen with IP phones. We also talked about why a Communications Manager server might not be available, how to identify a replication issue by using RTMT, and how to resolve it by using that utils db replication repair all command. We said that we're going to eliminate a lot of Unity Express troubleshooting issues by simply restoring it to factory defaults right off the bat. And we showed you some key things to look for in a Cisco Unity connection integration. Then we took a look at Cisco Contact Center Express, and we saw how we could check the status of the JTAPI integration between the UCCX server and the Communications Manager server, and how to do a resync if they were out of sync. And finally, we talked about some things to look for in the IM and presence server, and we were really big fans of that integrated system troubleshooter.